Tinky. Okay, so this time we're going to be doing bottoms. I think technically the instruction called them updated bottoms. So these are updated bottoms. But it reminds me, here it is, it reminds me a lot of a style that I've seen, you know, starting in the 80s, and it seems like every generation there's another version of this. But this one, it is a McCalls, but it's a Palmer plush pattern, and just opened it really quick and got to looking inside, and it has a whole bunch of extra stuff in the instruction sheet, extra things about fitting, pro tips, speed tips, things like that. So that's interesting. You know, it's more like a sewing class in a pattern, it looks like. So that's kind of fun. But anyway, this pattern, it does not have a zipper. It has slant pockets, and on one side the pockets open, and that's how you get in and out of them, is a pocket opening. So it has the two pockets at a diagonal, and it has a fitted shaped waistband, you know. It's not like just a straight band, it's more of a longer tapered. So that looks interesting. And then really full pleated pant legs. So this comes in a skirt and shorts and pants. Now, usually what they say is pants, I need to take up about 4 inches because my legs are shorter, but I am going to try to get to something about this length. Okay, well that length on me. And what I am going to be using is, I have a denim. It's a lighter weight denim. It's not like the super stiff jean stuff. It's something that should be able to pleat well and wash well and be comfy. You know, it's not as light as a chambray. It's not as heavy as a jean denim. It's like right in the middle. So I think that'll work pretty well. I have serged the edges, pre-washed it on hot, tumble dried it on hot, just to get any shrinkage that I can out of it. So that's about ready to go. So I'm going to get to cutting out my pattern. All right, I have my pieces cut out, and these leg pieces are extremely wide. So the only thing you're really going to need to make sure fits on you is your waist, because the hips are so wide, I don't think that there's going to be a problem. Now I need to cut 7 inches off the bottom of this pattern. And because it's so wide, the bottom is curved. So instead of just cutting straight across, you want to make sure that you're cutting with that same curve. So what I do is, I have my little ruler marked so I don't have to look too closely. I put a little mark all the way across, and then I am just going to cut and follow those marks, and that'll just put a very slight curve into my piece so it'll stay consistent with the design. I know that it says lengthen and shorten here, but I'm doing it off the bottom. I don't think it's going to make a difference, and it'll just make me happier that way. Now, a lot of times on pants patterns, a adjustment I have to make for myself is my waist is high, so sometimes I have to expand this. But just eyeballing it, I think it's going to be okay the way it is. Now, if I get it made up and the crotch is too high, I know how to lower it. And if it comes to that, I can show you how to lower it. But I'm just going to use this as is. But I just wanted to show you, these pieces are extremely wide. So if you're going to need to shorten them, do it when you're cutting out your pattern so you don't waste a whole lot of fabric, because that's a lot. And the staggering of these pieces is going to really be influenced by how wide these are. Okay, so I've got everything cut out. And now the first thing I need to do is get started marking. So there are a lot of circles to punch out on this pattern because of the pleats and darts and pockets and everything. So in case you've never seen before, I use this little tool. It's actually for leather work, and if you are looking for one, just do a search under screw type leather hole punch or automatic leather hole punch. That's how I found mine. So what I do is I stick a little piece of scrap leather. This is a piece of upholstery I cut up. Stick it underneath and just push down, and it cuts out the hole. And then I can come back, and because this is such a dark fabric, I'm actually just going to use a chalk pencil to mark it. But right now my fabric is pinned with the right side on the inside because I just cut it. Before I mark all of my pleats, I'm going to flip that because I mark my pleats on the right side of the fabric. So the way that I cut my notches is I don't... McCalls notches are so small. Have you ever noticed that? They're a lot smaller than Simplicity and stuff. But anyway, what I do is I take my scissors and I just cut a notch just to the tip of the little triangle. That's enough for me to see, but it's not enough to be super obvious. So let me cut my notches, punch out my holes, flip my fabric, and draw on my darts, and I will be right back. So I am just marking my front piece right now. I just mark it as I use it. So I wanted to show you, because these pleats come all the way down, I'm going to mark it, excuse me, with my chalk pencil, and then also come back and mark the line, just because it'll be easier to see. So you can see it on the pattern easier. There's a line right here, and I've drawn my 2 dots, but I'm actually, and this time I'm using a red chalk rotary pen. It's got a little wheel up here that the chalk comes out of, and I'm going to connect those with a line. That way I'll be able to see it a whole lot easier to make sure that that pleat is going to line up. So I'm going to do this side completely, and then I'll get the other front side and mark that up. And also on this front piece, there's a dot here for a big pleat that comes over, and there's a dotted line for stitching line. I'm going to go ahead and make a little notch with my scissors up here also, because that's going to give me a good guide of where this line from this dot down here is going to connect to. Okay, so starting to make the pleats on the front, they're going to be going towards the center front. So what you're going to do is take the first line and crease it and bring it over and match it up to the second line. Now you should be able to, when you have it placed correctly, that this top is nice and smooth and even. If it looks like that, say where something's poking up, I mean something's not quite in alignment correctly. So that's like a troubleshooting thing. When everything lines up smoothly, you know you're doing good. Okay, so now with these 2 pinned, we're going to come back and hand baste it. So I knot my thread, and I'm going to start down here at the bottom dot, just right here, and baste it straight up. And once you get all the way to the top, you can make a little back stitch, and then you go across the top so that you can hold all of those extra layers together. So I'm just going to keep going across till I get to the next pleat, and then head straight down and in my thread at the bottom. Okay, so now that I have my pleats basted down, I'm going to go ahead and serge around the outside edge of each piece. Now when I serge, I don't cut into the fabric, at least I try not to. I try to run it so my blade just skims along the outside edge. If it happens to trim off a loose thread, that is fine, but I want the size of the fabric to stay as close to the original size as possible. So I'm going to go all the way around both front pieces. Okay, so I know that I have shown this before, but it can't hurt to remind. I go over my pleats because I want them to have just one serged edge at this point. If I did it before I put my pleats in, that'd be a lot of extra bulk right here. So I'm going to just very carefully feed them in so that they don't want to sneak up on me. Now what I wanted to show you is that when you come to your corner, you're going to take it so that your needle goes almost all the way to the end. Raise your needle raise your presser foot and just turn the fabric, and then come back straight down the edge. Okay, so what that's going to do is allow you to have a corner without big tails coming out and everything. So it'll save thread and save time. So a little thing I like to do also before I get started with the project, I have one bobbin that's going to work, but I'm going to go ahead and wind a second bobbin right now because I know that this isn't going to last the whole project, and that way I won't have to stop later on. So let me go ahead and do this. Also, while I'm thinking about it, I need to change out my needle. So I had to actually pull out this 14 that I put in because the size was right, but I've reused this needle a couple times and I think that the point has become dull. So I put in a brand new 14 and it works fine. And I just want to point out how I do this. If I am sewing and I hear it and it sounds like it's having trouble breaking through the fabric, it's like instead of a nice smooth stitch, you hear what sounds like threads being chunked or something like that. And it just seems like it's working too hard. That's one sign. Also, I ran 2 of my bias tension testing and I could not get that top tension to work right. And it turns out it wasn't because of my tension adjustment or anything like that. It's because the needle wasn't working well. So I put in my brand new 14, set everything back to where I thought it should be, and I ran my bias strip and it snapped perfect and it's so nice and quiet. So sometimes it's just as simple as using a new needle. But in case you haven't seen this before, the way that I test my tension is I will take a piece of fabric and sew the stitch. You know, this is a woven, and I'll sew a stitch on the bias at a 45-degree angle and pull it. And if one side breaks, one thread, like say on mine the bobbin thread was breaking and my needle thread was not, and it did that a few times, that means the tension is not equal. The tension on top is not as tight as the tension on the bottom. So that's just a trick, you know. Use it for what you will, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this girl away because this needle doesn't need to be confusing me in my box anymore. And we're ready to go. Alrighty, so I can tell we're going to have fun with all these quick trip tips and pro tips and everything all the way down. They're basically giving you alternative ways. So if you do it by the quick tip way, it's not necessarily the same thing if you do it by the pro tip way. Okay, so getting started with the pockets here. I have pocket piece number 10, and I'm marking my dots. And if your dots look like they're going to blend in, another thing you can do is after you make your dot, make a circle around it like a bullseye, and it will stick out a whole lot more. I've got my notches clipped, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and serge around the outside. Now there is a difference in the way you treat the right pocket and the left pocket. So you need to pay attention to which is which. But first I'm going to serge around, and then it says between these 2 dots on this side, you're going to make a 5/8 inch hem on the left side. So we'll figure that out right after I serge this. This part here is cut on a diagonal, and normally it could be something you would stay stitch or stay tape, but because we're going with our pro tip instructions, they want us to try putting they call it seam binding. It's basically a non-stretch tape, like a twill tape. So I am going to put a strip of twill tape here, and you stitch through the twill tape. That's their pro tip, so you know, we are pros, we can do this. So what you do is take your pocket that goes with the left side. We're going to match up. All right, so if this, say, is my seam line, I've got it on here. Right there, okay. So I'm going to be stitching on this tape and continuing all the way to the edge of my fabric right here. So just all the way up along that seam tape. All right, so this is what our left front looks like right now. We have our pocket number 10 that has been sewn on with the twill tape at 5/8 inch all the way up. Now on your left pocket, see the instruction right there? On the left pocket only, you're going to hem 5/8 inch down to the dot. Okay, on the side front, which is this other pocket type piece, it's also on the left side only is where you're hemming on that part of the pattern also. So this is what we've got right now. We have the twill tape. Let me just explain this really quick here. So like say this is our twill tape and you have the pins that are holding it in place, but they're not holding it down, so that this can move up and down, but they can't move side to side because of the way that the pin is placed. That is because as you are stitching, you're pulling this tighter. You're going to make sure that there's not super tight, you're not tugging on it, but just enough tension on it so that when your machine goes down, this is going to hold nice and straight, because that's what's going to keep your fabric from stretching out. So it's kind of like running a stay stitch, a seam tape, and your final stitch all at the same time. That's what twill tape does. So, but that's how you do it, because if you were to pin this on like that, you can't adjust it as you go. The pin is going to take up all that slack. So, this is the next day, and don't be alarmed, it's just a rotary cutter accident, but you know, we go on. Okay, so normally I would be understitching this pocket, but we're going with their pattern, and what they want you to do is grade the seams and then roll it over, press it, and edge stitch it. So instead of understitching, which would naturally make that seam roll on its own, they're going to have us kind of try to do it by hand, pin it in place, and then edge stitch over the top to hold that roll that we put in place. So we will do that. So for grading, you can see they have the tape here, which it's fairly lightweight, so that's fine. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the next seam up about, you know, a fat eighth or an eighth of an inch above that. And then I'm going to take the final grade, just cut into my serging at the edge, so it's just barely stepped over. So that's how I'm going to do it. Once I have it all cut like that, push this open and I'm going to press it. So I have this pressed open, and I pressed it so my seam allowances are going towards the pocket. So now what it wants you to do is roll this edge over so that this seam is an eighth of an inch in. So if you can see, I'm not putting this seam line directly at the edge. I have it on the inside, and that does work well because it's very hard to get an exact edge when you use the twill tape, because it is sticking out that little bit. So this is going to be fine. Go ahead and pin it down. And come back on this side then, on the right side, and top stitch along this edge. So just a note, seeing that they want you to roll it an eighth is helping me understand their pattern, because it was driving me nuts. Let me raise this a bit. Here is my pocket piece, and here is my front. So if I match my notch here, this edge was a whole lot lower, and I couldn't figure out why they didn't want these things to match. But now that I know that they want you to turn this an eighth of an inch, that makes that gap understandable. So I wasn't going to say anything because I wanted to see how this whole thing played out, but if you're cutting out and it just doesn't look right to you because of this gap, that's because of the 1/8 inch seam allowance that you're going to be dealing with when you top stitch your pocket. So there you go. Alright, so the next thing we're going to deal with is this side front piece 11, and this side, the longer side, is the side that goes along your hips, okay? The left side, you can see right here, is hemmed between these two dots. So this is my left side, and so I have this one hemmed. So what we're going to do right now is just take it one at a time. So this is my right side piece here. Got my pocket sewed on in there. And what I'm doing is I'm going to put this, and do this on a flat table. Don't do it in your hand or something because it needs to be flat. There's a notch on this side over here, so I can match those notches. Stick a pin up here. And there's not a notch on the top, but I do have a dot. So if I stick a pin straight through my dot, dots normally indicate where two different pieces are meeting. So I have it marked on my back, but oh my goodness. Okay, so I have my pin in my dot. I should be able to just put this pocket, the edge of it, straight up next to my pin, and that will line it up with that dot right there. So let's see if that worked. If I look on the inside, I have these two pocket pieces and they match up. So that's the thing to do. So what it wants you to do first is just, with those two things matched up, your notch and your circle, it just wants you to pin this outside edge right here. Pin up here and pin down here. So we have all 3 layers together. You don't realize how much you use that finger. Okay, and now it says what it wants you to do is on the inside, so flip it over. Okay, on the inside, pin the pocket edges together. The edges will not necessarily match. Do not try to make them match, or you may get a bubble. Ah, okay, that's an interesting comment. And that's good. Honestly, it's a good comment, because sometimes as you're sewing things get a little bit skewed, and it sounds like their whole purpose is to make sure that this stays completely flat. So that comment is, in case, say this is a little bit further out or something, don't try to bring it in just to match this level, because then you'll end up with a bubble up here, which is fine. So what I would suggest is, with these pinned, you're just going to smooth it down. There's a pleat here, so you kind of have to work around that. But you're just smoothing the two pocket pieces together, and however they want to meet, that is how they will go. So I'm looking, and you can see one part is slightly outside. I'm not going to worry about that. I am just going to pin it and sew it with that over, and no one's ever going to know because it's on the inside. So now that we have this nice and smooth and everything, this is the seam we're going to sew. So I'm going to take out these pins that are holding it at the sides, because we don't need that. I'm going to move this one over here to the corner. You want to keep this pocket piece free. Okay, so with this pocket piece free, but knowing that it's pinned together in the right way, what you're going to do is come and sew along this edge, up and over. And then once you have it sewed, just press it flat. So this is the same thing you're going to do on the left side, except for the left side, these edges are hemmed. So you just start your stitching at this point, okay? But other than that, the left side is the same. So now that we have this sewed and I press these seams flat, I'm going to flip it back over to where it belongs and match it back up at the top. Like that. And over here at the side, I'm going to match these notches here back up, And because we were really careful to make it flat the first time, everything should be lining up well. So, here we go. So at this point, this is pinned, this is pinned. They want us to baste this edge, leaving this one just pinned together. So I just realized as I was sewing this on that I have my opening on the opposite side. It's not really going to impact the pattern at all. Just everything that I say is left is actually my right. So it's actually going to open on my right side. I don't know why I did that. Now it looks like I actually need this pleat marked on the wrong side of my fabric, and I have it marked on the right. So I am just going to transfer these markings over right now. So color in my dots. I have my top clipped up here, but I'm going to go ahead and draw this line up here at the 5/8 inch mark. And then connect this dot up to the notch at the top. So I have a nice defined line right there to follow, and also over here. Okay, so now I can see those, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the other side and put them together. Alright, so I have them pinned together. Now the only thing we're doing right now is just stitching this line right here, just between this dot and the very top. I have this pin just to keep it from moving and holding it in place, but we're just going to do this one stitch line. Alright, so now we put that part aside and start working on the back. So I have clipped all my notches, and now I know from experience that this mark has to be on the wrong side. So I can use my pen, yay, and mark all of my dots for my, the dots for my dart over here, and the dots for this. What I also do is I put a tiny clip at the top of this stitching line and this one, just because that's going to help me draw my lines. I do love my lines. So now that I have that, I'm going to come back with my heat erasable pen and connect all the dots on both sides. So I have that dot, this one, and I do draw the lines for my darts also. Okay, so that's how I mark it, and I'm going to do the other side and then pin my dart together. So to pin my darts, what I do is I put one pin through the dot up here, that way, just so I can grab it, and another one I go down in one hole and back up the other. So that way I can just pull those two together, lift this up, and I have that line. So I can grab another pin, put it in the middle, readjust this pin over here, and this one down here, just tuck it in there, and that way I have my seam line, and I start at the outside edge and work my way in. The next thing is to press your dart towards the center back, and I just wanted to show you, you probably know, but on an ironing board there's a crease here before you get to the really tapered front, and this crease matches up with these dart lines usually. So if you need to press, you can press it nice and flat, and it's going to wrap around. So, you know, they were smart when they made these things. Now, before I sew the center leg to the front and the back together, I'm going to go ahead and serge around the edge of each of my back pieces. Okay, so this piece is serged now. My back pieces are serged, and what we're going to do is sew the inside leg seams. So lay down your front piece that we sewed just that little bit together on, lay that down face up, and then put these down on top of it, and it'll make more sense what their picture and the directions say. So match up your notches, your edges, and just do a nice straight seam all the way down. And when you get done, what I'm going to do is actually at the very top here, like in the top 2 inches or so, I'm going to put a couple layers of stitches, just reinforcing, you know, can't hurt. But once you're done, press it open. Okay, so with this sewn, now we can just kind of lay, these are the fronts together, the backs together, and this is the crotch area. And I just have this pinned to hold it still right now, but the first thing we need to do is make this back pleat before we can sew this. So go ahead and make sure that your bottom dot is lined up on both sides and your top is, and sew this seam, you know, from top to bottom and reinforce at the bottom. Alright, so it's time to sew the crotch seam. How exciting is that? So here is how I would recommend. The front up here, I would start in the front, come all the way down, you know, around and back up, and then come back about where this curve starts kicking in. I would go back to the beginning of that curve and do a second line of stitching just inside the first one, so you have a double layer of stitches, and I think they even say that in the directions. Okay, so if you can see, I have 2 rows of stitching here. So what I'm going to do is down here where I have it double stitched, where it's getting close to the underside of the crotch, that's where I'm going to trim. And you can trim it straight. I'm going to get my old 1980s vintage Fiskars pinkers out. And trim it down. And I'm going to trim it about the same amount on each side. So I've got maybe about 3.5 inches on each side of this center seam. Okay, so now we're going to start messing with this dart. So this is my front piece. I have my pockets here, and my pockets are still just pinned. They are not sewn down. And what I need to do is open up the seam allowance on this pleat thing that we made. And I'm just going to do a little finger press to hold those seam allowances open there with my fingernail. Okay. So now I'm opening this up and I'm matching the center of my pleat with the center of my front seam, and I'm going to pin it down. Your directions are odd because their directions say make sure the pocket goes over this. Well, this ends much before this. I'm thinking that for a smaller size, I cut out a 16, and I'm thinking for a smaller size that might come into play where the pocket is over it. But for mine, yeah, I don't need to worry about that. And what I need to do now is come back and press this. So I get all of these pleats, these ones that I have basted, and the center one, and just have all of these pleats just nicely popped on. And I'll probably, when I use my hot steam iron, I'll use that wooden block, you know, that clapper block, and press them down too, just to try to make these pleats permanent. Open up this back piece, and the same thing, I'm just gonna finger press it with my fingernail just to keep that seam allowance pressed open here. Okay, and line this up with my center back. Okay, and so the same thing here, I'm going to open this up. It's harder when you don't have 2 fingers. Open this up, make sure that this seam allowance, here's the end of my dot that was a marking. I'm going to try to make it so that all the way down to this dot, it is right on top of the seam allowance underneath. And you can, like I said, you can kind of feel it with your finger. So again, here's the back, and I have it pinned at the very bottom where that bottom dot was. So I know that it's going to hold straight so that I can press this down and lock these pleats in also. Once you have all of your pleats pressed, go ahead and run a basting stitch across the top of your pleats. And you have to keep your pockets obviously pinned in where they are. So on the side where the opening is, you know, you open it up and baste from that point over. You're not basting it closed on that side. All of this basted together so it's not going to come apart on you. What the pattern wants you to do, which is actually a cool step, is put it together with the right sides on the outside, just laying these, and pin it down the sides, add a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and try them on just to see how they're going to look. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it, hold it up to myself, you know, try it on that way. Now with the understanding that you do have a waistband that is a couple inches wide, okay? So you're seeing how it fits on your hips and everything like that, but understand you're not pulling this straight up to where your waist is. You have a waistband that's about that tall that's going to be sitting on top of here. So this is how I'm pinning it. I have more pins up here around the hip than I do down here. They're spaced out a little bit more, but I do that on both sides. And this side pocket thingy where you get in and out, I'm leaving that open and I'm just going to hold it closed because I want to see what it's like pulling that in on me with that opening. So another thing, as I'm pinning, I just read in the instructions that the seam allowance for this side over here is actually 1 inch. And I guess because this is a specialty pattern where they're trying to teach you how to fit things, they wanted to make sure you had a larger seam allowance. And honestly, a larger seam allowance is pretty standard for a lot of garments that you're assuming that you're going to be taking to a tailor to have taken in or taken out. So that's fine. That's a good thing. I still have it pinned at 5/8, but I can, as I have it holding it on me, I can pinch it in a little more to get a better idea. But I just wanted to mention that so that when you pin it, just pin it at the 1 inch. Okay, so I tried them on, poked myself a few times. It might be worth it just to hand baste a stitch instead of pinning them if you're at all worried about getting poked. I think I would do that next time. But then the pattern is actually kind of cool because mine is going to fit me fine, it looked like, but it has some little tips, you know, attaboys, you can do it kind of things as far as alterations. It gives you an idea if your pants are too small, you can, you know, move your pins and try it on again and things like that. So that's kind of nice. It's more or less just common sense thing of taking the sides in more, kind of like when I did the princess seam dress. The idea of having the seam allowances on the outside is that makes it easier to move those pins to get a final placement, okay? So it's that type of deal where they're like, oh, if it's too big, you know, move them in. If it's too small, move them out. So that's nice. And then they show that if you do change it, mark your points. So like say I decided that this point needed to be in more and I'm moving my pins over here. Just like when I did the princess seam, it's saying mark those spots. And what they show in their diagram is to open it up and mark the insides. Okay, and that way you can see it on the inside because that's where you're actually going to be doing your final sewing. Alrighty, so say I was going to do that. I have these where my pins are in their new spot, let's say. I have that marked. Then when I take those pins off, I have my new sewing line that I can then, give me something straight here, I can then connect and gradually, you know, adjust. So that's kind of fun. I like that idea. Go ahead and take advantage of it since they give you a bigger seam allowance anyway and give you a step to remind you to do it. I think that's great. So, but moving on. So at this point it says unpin and cut the side seam allowances and the end seam allowances to 5/8 if necessary. So when I tried this on, it was going to fit me if this was at 1 inch. At 5/8, it was too big. At 1 inch, because I pinched it in with my fingers, that did fit. So because it fits at 1 inch, it doesn't want you to sew and leave a 1 inch seam allowance. Oh no, it wants you to cut off so that all you have left is 5/8 inch. So let me pull all these pins off and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to be sewing my outside side seam a little bit differently, and I just want to show you. I have 1 inch to play with. So let's say this is the edge of my fabric here. What I'm going to be doing is with the right sides out, so the wrong sides are together, so just like we tried it on here, I'm going to put them together and sew a line of stitching at 1/2 inch. Okay, so say I sewed it right here. I have my line of stitching I put in at 1/2 inch with both of these pieces together. Okay, so I hope you can see there's a line of stitching right here. That's at 1/2 inch. And now what I'm going to come back and do is trim it pretty close to that stitch, probably just under 1/8 inch away from that nearly invisible stitch. So now that I have it pressed open and I press this tiny little seam allowance towards one of the sides so it would be easier to do this, I'm going to fold it over and try to get that seam, see if you can see it right there, at the very edge. Basically we're doing a very wide French seam. A lot of times French seams are very narrow. This next stitch will also be at 1/2 inch. Okay, so now that I have this pressed, I'm going to do another line of stitching with this edge at my 1/2 inch mark. Okay, so this is the right side, this is the wrong side, and I went ahead and I pressed it, and I'm going to press it towards the back. So this would be the front where the pocket is, and this would be the back. And then I'm going to come back and run a row of top stitching along this edge. Okay, and what that's going to do is give you just a really nice, this one is actually opposite, but it's just going to give you a really nice finish, like a flat fell type thing. And normally you wouldn't be able to do this on the second seam of like regular pants, but these legs are so flared and so wide that there should be no problem digging yourself in to be able to do all of this. So that's how I'm going to be doing it, you know, to picture that other row of stitching here going all the way through. And another thing that's going to do is all of this bulk right here from this pocket, because we're going to have so many layers, it will all be encased in this little seam thing here, aiming towards the back, and it'll lay nice and flat. Alrighty, so we are starting the waistband part, and I'm very excited because what they are asking you to do is trim the excess interfacing from around the seam allowances of your pieces. So I think I've showed this on another video, but I'm going to show it again. Now what they recommend is that you leave 1/8 inch to catch the seam, and that is a good idea, especially for a denser fabric like this. The last time I showed it, it was for a band on a collar where there's not going to be a lot of weight on that collar, but something like this, definitely. So here's how I do it. On this pattern, I have my little table here set up. These are the pieces that I'm going to need to cut interfacing for at a smaller size than what these are. These pattern pieces include all the seam allowances. I want to make a pattern piece that does not include it. Now the side seams of all of these pieces are a 1 inch seam allowance. Okay, so if I'm taking out 1/8 inch, that means I'm going to set my seam guide to 7/8 of an inch. And I like this one because they're both prongs are metal. It's doable if one is plastic, but it's so much better if they're both metal. So anyway, with this set at 7/8, let's see here. I've already started this, but on the seams where it's a 1 inch seam allowance, you need to take it to 7/8. Use your seam guide, run the outside edge along the edge of the pattern. The inside, this prong here, is going to scratch out your pattern. So the way I set it up is I have my pattern pieces down first. I have a sheet of wax paper on top of it, and I have the wax paper taped down to my table. So I am just going through and I am doing all the 1 inch seam allowances first. Okay, and then I will come back And the rest, the top and bottoms of these, are a 5/8. So if we leave 1/8 of an inch on there, we need to set our seam gauge to 1/2 an inch. So it's the same thing where you run one prong along the outside edge of your pattern, and the inside prong is going to be going along the inside edge of your pattern. So now I am just cutting it out along that interior scratch line. So this is the original pattern piece here, and this is the pattern that I made. And you can see that it's going to give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, and down here where it has a 1 inch seam allowance, I have a bigger gap there. On a total other random subject, this little injury finally got me off my duff, and I ordered, these are shower grip handles that have suction cups on them, and I ordered a set of those. So now I have these on my big cutting or my big rulers and my big guides, so I don't do this. Don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. But yeah, these, they come all different brands and everything. I got these at Walmart, but I think that that's going to work for me. So anyway, okay, I want to show you one thing. On the diagram here, you can see that they want you to put interfacing on the pieces according to this layout, and this is for if you have your opening on the left. I of course did it backwards. My opening is on the right, so my layout will be the opposite. So I'm going to have my bigger piece on this side and my shorter piece on this side, okay? And this is my back piece. So I want to make sure that when I'm cutting out my interfacing, I am cutting out this pattern piece this way so that I have my big seam allowance and everything fits, and I have this one this way. Now, oddly enough, because I'm doing it backwards, if I cut it out with the print side up, it works for me. But what that means is if you're doing it according to the pattern, you're going to want to cut out your front interfacing pieces upside down this way. So this interfacing piece, then you would cut it this way, and that means that your fusey dots are going to be on the bottom and your regular side is on the top, but your pattern pieces are going to be, oops, wrong piece, but your pattern pieces, if you're doing it correctly, instead of this way, it's upside down, okay? So just like that with this one. So just a heads up, pay attention to the direction of your pattern pieces before you cut out your front interfacings. The back is the same either way, so it doesn't matter. So I want to show you my process for putting on interfacing. Again, first thing I do is iron my fabric, and I use a hot steam iron. I like the moisture, it really helps with the glue. So I iron my fabric first, just to make sure I get all the wrinkles out and it is as flat as possible. Now, because this has different seam allowances, I want to use my guide just to make sure I've got 1/2 inch where I'm supposed to, and almost 1 inch up over here, because that's the way it goes. It's got a big seam allowance on the side. So I cut this with 7/8 on this side. Make sure I got that, and the rest I think is good. So I'm going to go ahead and just set my iron straight down. I'm not wiggling it, I'm just setting it straight down. You know, count as long as you think. You're somewhere between 5 and 10. You want those dots to have a chance to melt. So now I can see, you can kind of tell when the dots melt, they disappear. I flip it over and I iron the good side. And that's just going to make sure there's no bubbles or anything that I might have missed. And that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other pieces. So the pattern wants us to try on our waistband before we sew it, which is great. They have you trying it on with the right sides out. I'm actually going to do it with the wrong sides out because on mine it's easier to see my marks. But because I ironed it and it's a heat erasable pin, I need to put my little dots back there. Because when I pin it, I need to be able to see where these two are supposed to overlap. So dot to dot kind of thing. So I'm going to go ahead, mark my dots, pin the sides together, and I am going to be pinning the sides. Let's see, this one will be down, this would be up, and I am going to be pinning the side at the 1 inch mark. So after trying it on, my waistband fit pretty well, and that's because when I chose this pattern, I chose it based on my waist measurement. So I was assuming it was going to fit, and it did. So what I'm doing here, actually I'm just finger pressing these seams flat. Since these are going to be encased in a waistband, I'm not going to do my little French seam deal on it. But what I am going to do is take some of that bulk out so you can trim it down. I'm just going to, I have these handy, so I'm just going to knock them down. And now what it wants you to do is do a test pinning of this waistband piece onto your garment, the bottom part. And it gives different alterations you can do if you have a flat rear, if you have a sway back, things like that, different waistband placements, which if that is your issue, it's nice to have this guide. And like say you have a sway back and it's saying, you know, a different waistband seam placement can help with that. And you can use that. If it works for you on here, you can use whatever method it is and then carry that same concept over to other patterns that are similar. So that's really nice. But I'm going to get down to here where I am going to actually pin my waistband onto my leg part, the main part. So this waistband is oddly shaped, obviously. So when you start to pin it on, there's a little dot here in the corner. It should be at the corner of your interfacing. That dot lines up with the edge of your fabric here. Okay, so it is going to stick out some. Don't worry about that. It's at this point here that what you need to worry about is if that is lining up at the very edge of your fabric. Okay, now when I was cutting out my pieces, on the front of the waistband, I make tiny clips at the center front, and that comes in handy because you need to match up. I match up that little clip with that seam in the center front, okay? And then you can match up this side seam with this side seam, and the same thing with center back with the side seam over here, and coming all the way around to another point where that is the point at the tip of your interfacing that needs to match up with the dot on here, which should be at the very edge. Usually the dots are at the edge. So get those main points on there and then just work everything else in. Okay, so I got a problem here and I want to explain what is going on. I was just happily pinning my waistband on, and all of a sudden in the front, nothing is fitting right. So I went back and I pinned the pattern together, and I placed it over this, and I'm comparing things, and I'm comparing it with the interface, with the waistband piece, and this is what I found out. All right, when we were doing this step here, sewing the pocket on, let me come down here, this step here of sewing the pocket on, there is nowhere on here which says what seam allowance to do that at. So based on the pictures and based on just normal sewing life, I did 5/8. Apparently this was supposed to also be a 1 inch seam allowance based on how their dots are. Okay, So when I sewed this at 5/8, all of a sudden everything is thrown off. So I'm going to do my best to like tear apart some seams and fix this, but be aware, do not sew this pocket onto your front at 5/8. They're not going to tell you in the instructions. They're going to say the side seam has to be 1 inch, but they don't say this does. But this is your pattern piece, okay? And a cheat that I should have paid attention to is where the dots are. The dots are at the edge of the fold, okay? So by default, measuring these dots, they should have been at 1 inch, and I was assuming the 1 inch was just coming all the way up this way, but it is also coming this way. And you can tell because of the placement of this dot. So I'll be right back after I fix my front. Well, that was not fun. What I played with opening up the pockets down here and adjusting. I played with adjusting pleats. And finally what I decided was the best solution for me was just to extend this waistband. So basically I needed to bring a couple more inches onto this waistband. The overall length is fine because this waistband was too short. This waistband underneath here was too long. But when I overlap them, I marked exactly where they're supposed to meet according to the pattern, and we should be back on track. But that was not fun. Just pay attention to this pocket. That's kind of sneaky, in my opinion, the way that it worked out. But, you know, we endure, we persevere, and we make it work. So, anyway, onward and upward. So, oh, and I was thinking while I was doing this, do you remember when I was putting on the waistband and it said, oh, make sure your pleats are behind your pocket? And I said, I don't have to worry about that because I'm making a size 16. That must be for a smaller size. That should have been my key to look at it, because if I had used the bigger seam allowance, I would have had to deal with that. My pleats would have been slightly different diameter, different dimensions and everything, and that would have been an issue. So anyhow, what I've done, I've gone ahead and sewed it on. So I've got that stitch there. I've sewn on my waistband, which is going to take us over here to step number 25. So what I need to do is go ahead and sew the pieces of the waistband together that did not have the interfacing, you know, sewing the back to the front. Oh, but before I do that, I need to extend this piece of this waistband also. You do not, because you're not going to make that error. But let me do that and then sew these pieces together like it shows here. Just thought I'd show you in case someone else does do the same thing. The way that I extended this is I have my pieces put together as they should be, and first I sewed it together, just a big long strip. But the way that I trimmed it is I matched my center. Okay. Let's line up this side over here. So I'm matching up my centers, and then I could just extend, drawing out lines, following around this edge, so that then I can come back and just trim it. And it's going to go ahead and match this part too, the way it should. And also, when you are sewing these pieces, make sure you're still using the 1 inch seam allowance on the side seams. Okie doke. So I have this waistband sewn together, and once again I am going to trim these seam allowances, these 1 inch ones, because I have a lot of bulk going on at my side seams. Okay, so here I am matching up my additional pieces. And I'm going to go ahead and match it up all the way around, pinning around the top and these sides here. And when I'm pinning it, I'm going to fold up the bottom just over here. I'm not going to fold it all the way across just right at the seam, so that when I come and I stitch that, it'll already be folded up, if that makes any sense. So the first thing, like I said, I'm doing, excuse me, is taking some of the bulk out of the corners. And what I'm going to be grading is the side that has the interfacing on it. Okay, this side here. I am cutting it to a fat 1/8 of an inch. And then, hang on, let me do some of that. This is my additional piece. We don't need to look at that. And that should just about take off your interfacing, any interfacing you have left. Now the next side out, I am taking it down to about 1/8 of an inch beyond that. Okay, so they had us cut our interfacing so 1/8 of an inch was going to be beyond the stitching line, and that's all I have showing anymore. The next one is beyond that. Now what the instructions say is from this point, go ahead and turn it and slip stitch this down over. But before I do that, I am going to come back and on my garment side, trim off, basically trim off all of my serging and stuff, that whole top 1/4 inch, because I've got a lot of layers going on here, and there are some places where it is super, super thick, and I just want to take some of that bulk out. The whole point with grading is that, say, you don't have everything ending at once. If everything, say I've got like 4 layers of denim here, and everything is ending at once, you're going to get a very obvious thick, thick, thick to normal. Whereas if you have it graded and you know one thing ends here and another thing is ending here and stuff, it's not going to be as obvious. Everything's going to lie smoother. It's going to feel a lot better. So that's the whole point of this whole grading thing. So what I'm going to be doing, again, this part is not in the instructions, but I can't help myself. It's just coming in here and basically cutting off the top 1/4 inch, cutting off a lot of this thickness up there, just to even things out. I am leaving the waistband part at its full length. Now while I'm sitting here cutting, I'm thinking, if you're going to do this, make sure at this stage, before you start grading, that you pull the whole thing and try it on again. Because once you do this, it's going to make it very difficult if you need to change things on the waistband. Okay, now I want to show you the pattern does not call to understitch, and I'm going to understitch, because what you have to do, and it's more difficult and it doesn't look as nice, is basically try to get that seam right on the very edge and clip it in there before you can come down here and do your understitch or whip stitching down here. And you're going to end up where you can see this a lot of the places. In my opinion, it's more difficult to get it so that it's going to lay nice and smooth. So before I whip stitch this stuff, I am going to understitch. Alrighty, so I wanted to show you how it looks when I understitched it. This is what it looks like on the right side. If you can see, there is a little row of stitching up here on the inside of the waistband. Okay, so here's the front, here's the top of the waistband, and the understitching is up here. So on the underside, this first line here, that's the seam that we sewed it together. This line on top of it, that's the seam of the understitching. Okay, so because I did that, hang on. Okay, so because I understitched it, now it's very easy, and as soon as I turn it, everything is automatically, all those seams are automatically going to roll towards the inside, because that's the side that we understitched to. Like if I had put the stitching on this side, it would want to roll that way, which, you know, wouldn't defeat the purpose, but that's what would happen. So this way, all I have to do is basically just fold it over And I have a beautiful edge on that front. Now, if I want to come back and top stitch over that, and I think that they're going to want you to top stitch, you can't. But it's not necessary at this point because this is taking care of that whole fold, and it's a much cleaner look. So, with that done, I'm going to go ahead and just fold it over nicely because now it's easy, and pin it down here at the seam line and go ahead and get started whip stitching that in. Okay, so I have the whip stitching done all the way around, holding down my waistband. So that is pretty much done. I am not going to be top stitching. They say that you can, but since I understitched it, I just don't see it necessary. And so I'm not going to. So the next step is putting on buttons. Now, I did extend my little piece here, so I'm not going strictly by their buttonhole placement, but I can tell by, here is their dot, marking the 5/8 inch seam allowance on this side, and I can tell they want their buttonholes to start 5/8 inch from there when I measure it. So I went ahead and on my edge, I don't know if you can see, but I drew a red line with my heat erasable pen, 5/8 inch in, all the way up. So I know that's where I'm going to start my buttonhole. And these are the ones I'm going to be using. They're little metal buttons with a shank. And so when I'm going to be placing them like this. Whoopsie. Here. Like this. And so the distance between these two buttons is 1 inch. So I went ahead and at 1 inch between them, I drew lines this way. And that is the track that my buttonholes are going to run. So I'm going to go set up and use my buttonholer on my treadle machine as I always do. So I've got my buttonholes sewn in. If you want more information on my buttonholer, I have a separate video explaining it. And I'm going to be using my buttonhole cutting scissors, and that gap is for putting in the part you don't want cut. And you start the blade in the buttonhole. And I usually put a pin at the end, but I'm feeling rebellious and gutsy today, because this is a very, very hard buttonhole. You know what? This fabric is so thick and I have so many layers, I'm going to get my chisel. Hold on a second. This is a buttonhole chisel, and it'll cut through anything, and it's really accurate as far as the end piece. So I actually think this will be a better solution for today. So I'm just going to make sure my end of it is where I want it to be and push straight down. And that's going to get through all of those layers. I'm going to do it for the other buttonhole here. Okay, so then after I cut it, I like to run my fingers around in the buttonhole to get any loose threads out of there and trim those off. So the first thing I need to do is make sure that I'm lining this edge up correctly. And it should be 1.5 inches from the center seam. Should be where this lines up. That's where the dot should be. And the dot is the edge. So this is the point where you want to just double check and make sure excuse me, that this level is correct. Because if you put your buttons on wrong and it goes like that or that, you know, that's going to bother you. So at this point, I'm lining it up. I'm making sure the top edge is exactly where I want it. Everything else is good. Now your button usually goes over here. It's not, you don't put your button in the center because that's not where it's going to fall. It's going to fall over here. So I'm putting my pen over on this side of the buttonhole, drawing a couple circles. Ooh, that's still a little damp. My steam iron got a little testy there. But I have my dots there where I am going to sew my buttons on. So these have shanks on them. If they didn't have shanks, then I would probably make a little thread shank. But once they do, I am just fine. So I'm going to go ahead, sew those on with my double-ended loop method. I want to show you this thread. It's actually kind of cool. It is made for buttonhole, or for sewing on buttons. And what it is it's got a fusible on it. So once you're done sewing your button on, and it's very, very strong, you hit it in the back with an iron over where your loose threads are, and it basically melts the glue that's on here, and it glues those threads so there's no chance for it to come off. So it's kind of cool. I have one in black and one in white. Caught them one day just on a whim, and I kind of like it. So if you see it, that's just an interesting thing. So if you haven't seen it before, this is how I sew on my buttons. I use a needle threader because I fold a piece of thread in half and pull both tail ends. So there, pull both tail ends through the needle at once. So I have them both sticking out like this. And I have a loop down here at this end. So with my thimble, because I always need a thimble. I can't go without. I pull it up through, but I don't pull it all the way, so that loop stays at the end. Slip it through my button, put it back down, and then when I pull it back down, I'm going to slide my needle through that loop, and that's going to lock it in place so I don't need a knot back there, and it's nice and secure. Okay, the next thing to do is get a skirt hook, so a hook and eye, and the skirt hook you're going to be putting so that the hook part is facing up, and you're centering it kind of between where these two buttons are. Center that straight over. And when you sew on one of these, what I do is I make sure each direction is reinforced. So I hit a few times on this side, down here, over here, and then I actually come back through and I go around my entire loop and hold that secure down at the bottom also. So I am doing the same thing with my double-tailed loop method of threading my needle to sew this on, and I'm placing it about, so the edge of it is about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. So I position the eye, which is a bar for the skirt hook, based on where the corresponding place is for my hook. But when you sew it on, you have to be careful you don't go all the way through, because the back of this is the side that shows. So you don't want to be poking it all the way through. So just take little stitches all the way around those little eyes just to hold it in place. And when I am done with my thread, what I do is I will take, say, a little stitch inconspicuously, next to wherever I am, and I'll do that maybe 2, maybe 3 times in the same spot, and then just clip the thread right next to it. And then with this thread in particular, then I will iron it. Alrighty, so right now I am pressing the hem on the bottom of my legs up 1.25 inches. And I'm going to be doing a hem using stretch lace because there's so much bulk right here on this side seam that I don't want to deal with turning it under twice. And there are ways around it. There are ways that you can clip out a section of the bulk when you turn it in. But I just don't want to deal with that right now, so it's going to be another stretch lace type of hem. Now I'm going to be doing this a little bit different than the seam tape I usually use, or the stretch lace I usually use is the narrow one. And I actually want to use, for once, a stretch lace that's roughly the same color. Okay, but I don't have enough of this kind. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to slice it in half. So I'm just going to show you the way that I'm doing it. So this is my lace cut in half, and I am sewing this part of it, this part, just straight down the edge, and I'm lining up the edge of my lace with the edge of my fabric and doing just under 1/4 of an inch straight stitch all the way down, and I'm going to wrap it all the way around the leg. So now that I have this sewn on the edge, what I'm doing is just pushing it up and pressing the lace up over the edge. You know, I'm not ironing over the crease that I already put in, but just pushing this lace up so it's going to peek over the edge. So now all I have to do is machine stitch down the edge of the lace here. And the good part about this is because it's staggered, you're not going to have a big chunk. And with really heavy fabric, sometimes when you fold it over and fold it over again, it tends to get a little stiff. You tend to see a little ledge right there, and doing it this way, you don't have any of that going on. So that's one of the great reasons I like to use stretch lace on things like this. Okay, I'm just sewing along, and I thought of something else I want to show you. When you're sewing denim or something that has like really thick seams, if you just sometimes with some machines, if you go over them and you have that big step up gap, you might skip some stitches. And there's different things, and this is one. I've had this forever. It says Oxmoor House Point Turner, but it's got 2 different depths. It has one here that's, oh, what is that? About a 1/16 of an inch. No, a little less than 1/8 of an inch, and this is about half. So what I do is with the needle down, oops, my foot's undone. Okay, so with the needle down, I pull this in when I'm getting close to the place I have to step up, and I'm already at the right level, so I'm not going to skip any stitches when I get to it. Hang on a second, let me tuck this lace in. Okay, it's the same thing. Once you get onto that big step, turn around and put it on the other side. And actually, I need this height on this side, so I can come over here, and I'm still on the same level until I'm totally cleared of this spot here. Lift up my presser foot, put it away, and it goes back down. So I'm sure they still sell these things, but like I said, that's, can you see it? There, that's what mine says, Oxmoor House, but I'm sure they sell these things still. But that's just another little helpful hint when you are sewing something very, very thick. So it's done, and they are super comfy. I like that a lot. Now, I think that it actually went together pretty well, but pay close attention to those seam allowances, especially that pocket one was tricky. That was a sneaky thing. So pay attention to the 1-inch seam allowance on that slanty pocket part. Other than that, it went together really well. I like some of the tips they threw in, some of the extra hints for fitting and things, so that was good. And I liked that they told you when to try it on in the process if you've never done that. You know, I can think back on when I was young and so many times that you just basically are sitting there in a t-shirt and nothing except for your underwear sewing because you're trying it on constantly. I'll probably edit that out. But anyway, I like it. The fabric that I made it out of, I think, suits it really well. And it is very, very comfortable. You feel like there's nothing tight anywhere, which is nice, which is really nice. And usually my body type, I have a higher waist, so usually I have to take the crotch down a little bit, and I didn't with this. So they size it with enough ease that you can feel comfortable. But it seems like just looking in the mirror and things, it looks almost like a skirt from the front and from the back also, which is nice. So I like that. I can't really think of a negative except for the trickiness of the seam allowances. The whole part where they have you trim down your interfacing, you know, I love that. I think excessive interfacing is a problem in commercial patterns in general, so I really like that, and I hope that you can use my little method of using the wax paper to take that extra out. And the thing is that once you make that little wax paper pattern and you keep it in here, you're going to save that whole step next time, and it'll go even faster. So I like it. I think I will make it again. I think it would be a good thing to make maybe in like an olive green or something for me, or something like that. But yeah, it's good. So I hope you liked it, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Bye.